Welcome, and thank you so much for coming along. Can you hear me all right? Yep. Yeah, fantastic. It's fantastic to see so many people here. It should be a great night, I feel. Welcome to the Joinery, which is the building that you're sitting in, the old Central Bus Station, which is being transformed into a community space to do events such as this, a chance for us all to get together and have some real meaty conversations about the future we all want. I'd like to start off by acknowledging we meet today on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and the Joinery sits on those lands, and we acknowledge and respect the spiritual relationship the Kaurna people have with their country, and also acknowledge this relationship continues for the living Kaurna people today. My name's Craig Wilkins, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Conservation Council of South Australia. And it's my very, very great pleasure to be sitting on stage with one of Australia's best known and best respected experts on energy, Dr. Mark Diesendorf. Welcome, Mark. We could have a round of applause for Mark. As well as being the crowd here tonight, we've actually also live streaming across the state, and there are people in Ceduna, so welcome Ceduna. Thanks for joining us, and for everyone else who's around and listening, it's fantastic you can join us, and hopefully it'll be a useful chance for you to also get a sense of what Mark has to say. I'll start off by introducing Mark, and then in terms of the sort of format for tonight, Mark's been in an all-day session today. It was a national workshop on nuclear energy, and at times it felt like Mark against the world, a room full of people out for blood, or not quite that bad, but it was a fairly intense day. So we're kind of hoping today is going to be, or tonight's going to be a bit better, and a bit easier on him than some of the that really intense intellectual backwards and forwards which he had to engage on today. And it's really interesting about, I mean, in terms of the context about this conversation we're having. Today, as the Conservation Council, commissioned Dr. Diesendorf to write a report on whether it's possible for SA to be 100% renewable in 15 years. And Mark came back with an emphatic yes. That report was released today. We've had quite good media, and what was fascinating was there was a panel tonight which was led by an advertiser journalist with a number of different guests. And a good sort of first sort of quarter of that panel session was dominated by Mark's report. It's clearly hit a chord, even amongst that audience which was focused on nuclear power. But it's not just, I mean, it's the conversation about the Royal Commission. It's also in the context of the amazing change that's going on in energy. I mean, the revolution is underway. In the last 3 years, the transformation and the change has been extraordinary. And what is fascinating and exciting is fascinating in terms of how behind some people are, but also how exciting and how this idea of perhaps leapfrogging into a really exciting future is starting to take shape. I was just looking today on. There was a news report about from July 2013 saying that SA is approaching 30% renewables, and many people thought it wouldn't happen, but here we are. That was less than 2 years ago, and here we are, 40%. And the expectations are this will keep on happening, and that is a really, really amazing space to be in. In terms of what else is happening around us, we're really keen to promote this report and get it out there as widely as possible. We've commenced an online petition and really encourage you to sign on. In fact, Kat at the back is holding up an iPad which you can actually sign in right now, and if you want to do it, and we can pass it around. We're really keen to spread the word, to try and get that word out there as widely as possible. There's also contact lists. There's a lot of people who are very, very keen to do work in this area, on renewables, but also in opposition to the Nuclear Royal Commission. So please sign up if you want to get involved in that. The format for tonight is essentially, I'm going to throw a few questions at Mark and then open it up to the crowd and very much have a conversation and really a chance, I think, to sort of go a bit further into depth about some of the concepts which Mark talks about and see if we can actually have a really, really decent and detailed conversation. So, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mark Diesendorf. He is probably well known to many of you. He is the, I think, acting director of the Institute of Environmental Studies at the University of New South Wales. Before that, he was at CSIRO. He's been at the ANU, the UTS. He's worked in the private system and consultancy. And he teaches researchers and consults in a wide range of fields across energy, policy, transport, theories of sustainability, ecological economics, and what is really, I think, quite heartening is he's not afraid to get in there and mix it in the real world in terms of policy discussions and the community, and better stand up and represent the community sector as well. He's he is co-editor of a range of books and papers, including his most latest one, which is a complete authorship of Sustainable Energy Solutions for Climate Change, which I'm sure he'll talk about in a moment as well.
Could I just say, unfortunately, I went to a public meeting in Newcastle a few days ago and sold all my copies except one. I'm selling them at wholesale price, which is what I get them for. So there's the one copy. Don't sponsor it.
Yeah. Oh, we might have to bid it, auction it. Yeah, raise funds, fantastic. But yeah, we're very, very blessed to have Mark here tonight. So we've got about almost 2 hours. Think of some great questions, and we'll have plenty of chance for that throughout the night. But thought I'd start by throwing a question at you, Mark. I'm keen to find out a little bit more about you, about some of the reasons why you're in this area. So I suppose, why energy, and in particular, why renewable energy?
That's a hard one. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Okay, I think it's really a question about how I became a young radical. That's when I was young. I guess it started with my what happened to my PhD thesis. I discovered that my PhD thesis which was an applied mathematical theoretical physics study on what happens in the interior of the sun. And when I visited one of my thesis supervisors in the US, one of my thesis examiners in the US after I had got my PhD, the first thing he said was, my colleagues at Livermore is a hydrogen bomb factory, are using your thesis for their calculations. Oh. And I said, no, that's impossible. My work is to do with the interior of the sun. It's an equilibrium situation. A nuclear explosion is not at all equilibrium. And he said, aha, but they have very complicated computer programs to try to analyze what happens in a nuclear bomb explosion, and they need to test their program. And your program, your calculations, your mathematical calculations are being used to test their program in the special case of equilibrium. And that was a bit of a shock, and it led me into joining, I moved to London on a postdoc, and I joined the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science. And they are a fantastic group, including Nobel Prize winners and so on. And that really inspired me to want to do science for the people and not to do science for the military or big business or other very powerful interests. So I guess that was the start. And I got into energy very early in the late 1970s, so it gives you a picture of my great age. And at that time, there was some really interesting papers being published on wind power the potential that wind power might be able to be used on a large scale to generate electricity. And I started doing some research in here. I was in CSIRO at the time, and I heard that a school in Denmark called Find was just building the world's largest wind turbine. The teachers were building it. So I went to Find and stayed there for a few days and got into the atmosphere and decided I really wanted to become active in researching and consulting and teaching and promoting renewable energy. So that was back in 1978, and I'm still going, still trying. So I guess that's, in a nutshell, how I got into it.
Do you call yourself an optimist?
I would say I'm a long-term optimist and a short-term pessimist. I think in the long term, Australia will be running predominantly on renewable energy. But I think by that time, we'll be seeing really massive climate change impacts, unfortunately. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but we're really heading very fast into climate crisis. We can already see the frequency of droughts and bushfires and related things is measurably increasing statistically significantly in Australia and in parts of the United States and several other parts of the world. We're starting to see in some parts of the world increasing in flooding, the frequency of flooding, and really we're moving into climate change right now, and it's going to get worse before it gets better.
So, which gets us to this imperative to move quickly to 100% renewable. So, maybe just could you paint a picture of how long ago you thought this was possible in terms of 100% renewable for Australia, and then what it means in terms of our state and the kind of technologies required.
Okay, well, in 1978. I was secretary of a group in Canberra called the Society for Social Responsibility in Science. And one of the things we did was we organised a national conference on energy and people. And at that conference we had some international speakers as well. And it became clear that in fact there was, as we saw it then, huge potential for renewable energy, and in particular wind power, even though there wasn't at that time a commercial industry except for very small wind turbines. And Australia, in fact, had a small wind turbine industry, but had been wiped out by the extension of the electricity grid, which was heavily subsidised and wiped out these small battery charging wind turbines. So at the time there was no large-scale industry, and I wrote a paper suggesting that on the southern coastline of Australia, which includes South Australia, there was a huge potential. And of course I got really laughed at, as you can imagine. You know, here's the man with the wind. And you can imagine all the scorn and so on. But a group of us set up a community group called the Australasian Wind Energy Association, which was a funny mixture of academics and do-it-yourself enthusiasts. And we built up membership of many hundreds around Australia. It was really exciting, and we flew in a small plane that one of our members had around the country giving talks at farm events and fairs and all sorts of events, and started trying to mobilise interest in wind power. So that was back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And if I can just indulge a little bit more, at that time, CSIRO, where I worked, was ruled by an executive that was very heavily into coal. And in 1982, they unilaterally announced that all renewable energy research in CSIRO would be shut down. And CSIRO was leading the world in solar hot water research. It was one of the leaders in passive solar housing, in bioenergy, in the division of chemical technology, and our own group was doing some of the earlier studies, or the earlier studies in Australia, on integrating wind power into electricity grids. You know, that challenging thing, a fluctuating source. How do you integrate it into electricity grids? And at a stroke of a pen, without giving any reason except saying, well, CSIRO's priorities have changed. They closed research in renewable energy across the whole country. And for at least a decade, nothing happened in renewable energy. I was forced to be retrenched because I wanted to keep working in the field, and so were others. And it was a really difficult time. That was back in the 1980s. Fortunately, CSIRO is doing some renewable energy research now, but it's not a major part, really, of their energy research. I'm not sure if I've answered your question. I've totally forgotten what the question was.
We can explore it in a moment. I am fascinated though with your evident long-term passion for wind energy. What's your reaction to our esteemed Prime Minister's comments in the last week or so about wind?
Well, I guess I'm a political cynic, so I don't think he has any emotional feelings for or against wind power, for a start. He's a politician. What he's saying is, I am going to stand by the coal industry until it dies. And right now it's dying in South Australia. And the only tragedy is it's pulling down the workers at the same time. But the coal industry is really finished in the long term, or even in the medium term, in Australia and around most of the world. In the United States, thanks to one of the few things that Obama has actually achieved, is to get the US Environmental Protection Agency to put carbon dioxide emission limits on power stations, to treat carbon dioxide as a pollutant. And as a result, almost all the proposals for new coal-fired power stations in the US have terminated, and a lot of the most polluting coal-fired stations are now starting to close down. And we're also seeing a same situation in parts of Europe, where wind and solar are growing rapidly. So it's a very exciting time of transition.
Yeah, this is what is supposed to be happening, and yet there seems to be some angst. But that's kind of why we invested in the RET, and as a society, it is fascinating to see such a massive backlash when it's working exactly as it's intended.
Well, yes. I mean, the renewable energy target has been very successful. It was a very modest thing, really. But even under John Howard, back in 2005, the RET gave sufficient confidence to investors that one of the world's largest wind turbine corporations, which in fact is Vestas from Denmark, set up a factory in Portland, Victoria, to build its giant blades because it had orders for a number of wind farms. And it set up another factory in Wynyard in Tasmania to make other components. And a lot of these components would have been very expensive to export from Denmark into Australia. They're large objects. And it actually was more cost effective to manufacture them in Australia. And then there were a number of Australian companies started up building towers for wind turbines. And in fact, there's one still surviving, although it's had to shed a lot of people in Victoria. And, you know, the potential was already seen. And then what happened was, as the 2007 election approached, and Kevin Rudd promised to expand the renewable energy target, it was all very exciting. But unfortunately, by 2006, John Howard's target for 2010 had already been reached. And then when Kevin became Prime Minister, he and his colleagues took 3 years to expand the renewable energy target. Even though all the legislation was already there, all they had to do was actually increase the target. And clearly the energy minister in that cabinet, well, he was a fossil fuel man, a coal man from way back. His family had shares in coal, and that was delayed. So, you know, if we're going to make any political criticisms, one would have to criticise both major parties here. That it was very disappointing. And what happened was that those factories that were set up closed down. The workers were thrown out of work, and we lost an opportunity, a huge opportunity. If the policy had expanded and continued, wow, where would we be now? We would have thriving industries with quite a lot of local manufacturing.
So we've got your report, which there were some copies at the back, but it's available also online, the Conservation Council website, which will form part of a submission to the Royal Commission into Nuclear Energy. Paint us a picture of what that 100% renewable for SA looks like in terms of the mix of technologies and how we actually get there.
Okay, so the first thing to say is that it's not wind power alone, or it's not solar alone. The reason that we can get a reliable system with 100% renewables is that there's a mix of different sources with different statistical properties. On their own, each technology would have enormous difficulties in supplying the state's electricity demand. Putting them together, it becomes possible to have a reliable system. And so already now, we have a system that's strongly dominated by wind because it's the cheapest of the renewable energy technologies available in South Australia. But we also have a quarter of the households in South Australia with solar PV on their roofs, and that's fantastic. So adding them together, it's about, as I think you mentioned earlier, Craig, about 40% of South Australia's electricity consumption is now coming from renewable energy. Now you're asking me, what does a picture of 100% look? Well, it would have more wind, it would have a lot more solar photovoltaics, not only rooftop, but also on the ground solar farms, solar power stations, on land that is not high quality agricultural or land or high quality for other purposes or for natural purposes. But that wouldn't be enough. It would need to have a bit more storage in the system. So it would also have a contribution from what we call concentrated solar thermal power. And basically that is a concentrated solar thermal power station has thousands of mirrors, and in one type they focus all the sunlight onto a central tower, and that enormous heat that's generated, several hundred degrees, 500 degrees maybe, is used to turn water into steam and to turn a steam turbine to generate electricity. But the beauty of that system is that some of the heat can be stored. Some of the heat that's collected during the daytime can be stored in tanks of molten salt. And they're doing this quite extensively in Spain and California and a few other parts of the United States, and currently in the Middle East as well, because a lot of the oil producing countries have realised that in fact it makes more sense for them economically not to provide cheap oil for all energy demands within their own countries, but rather to export the last remaining oil at high price overseas and to generate their own power locally with solar. So coming back, we'd have that mix of two types of solar with some storage and wind. Now, when we did our computer simulations, and we started by doing the whole national electricity market, which starting at South Australia, it goes South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales and Queensland. They're all joined together by transmission lines. And in that system, in addition to the two solars and the wind, we would have existing hydroelectricity. And of course, as you know, you don't have any hydroelectricity currently in South Australia because you don't have a lot of fresh water for a start. But we'll come back to that because there are some possibilities there. And we found then that still there were occasions, particularly on winter evenings, after an overcast day, when there hadn't been enough solar energy and there wasn't enough wind energy to meet demand for maybe 1 or 2 hours on the winter evening, during the peak demand period when people have dinner on a winter evening. So we filled that gap in what we saw then as the cheapest possible way. And the cheapest possible way, and now don't shudder because I'll explain in a bit more detail, the cheapest possible way was with what we call gas turbines, open cycle gas turbines. Now a gas turbine is basically a jet engine. It's a very flexible technology. If you've seen them at the airport, they start up and come up to full power within about 10 minutes. So they're very flexible, they can go on and off very quickly. Because they are mass produced overseas, they have very low capital cost, about $800 a kilowatt. Now, of course, if you're going to fly from Adelaide to London, the fuel cost would be enormous. But we found in our system, we only need them infrequently and for short periods of time, usually a couple of hours. So in that case, the fuel cost is low too. So provided you have a store of fuel, they basically play the role of reliability insurance with a low premium. Now, we already have gas turbines on the grid in South Australia in the national electricity market, and they're fuelled on natural gas. But a gas turbine can be fuelled on almost anything that burns. It can be fuelled on fossil fuels, it can be fuelled on renewable liquids and gases. You can even run gas turbines on solids if you chop them up into fine particles and so on, although that's more difficult. So it's a very flexible technology just for filling a few gaps. And so the idea would be initially they would continue to be fuelled on natural gas, but as we build up the capacity to produce more renewable liquids and gases from agricultural residues, for example, they would gradually move over to fully to renewable liquids and gases. The only trouble is there's going to be a fair bit of competition for renewable liquids and gases because the airlines don't have currently, they don't have any other alternative to fossil fuels in their jet engines or in their piston engines for that matter. And so at present, if you fly around Australia or overseas, you might find that one of your engines is actually running partially or totally on biodiesel or ethanol or methanol from biofuels. They won't tell you, but they are trying it and it is working. So there's going to be competition there. So I don't feel comfortable in the long term with using biofuels, but in the short, as a sort of short to medium term, until we have cheaper battery storage and cheaper other forms of storage, it's a mighty handy technology. And it doesn't have to be gas turbines, it could be diesel generators running on biodiesel, for example. They're equally cheap, and provided they're paid an incentive to act as a kind of standby, they can also help to fill gaps, occasional gaps, which are not very frequent and not very long in the wind-solar combination.
Which gets us onto this this idea of baseload power. It's certainly dominated today's conversation at this workshop, and it seems to be the area which is perhaps least understood by people in terms of what you are advocating for in terms of your shift. Because if I've got it right, you almost turn the concept of baseload on its head. So rather than think about having technologies like coal or nuclear chugging away all the way on a base, and then having those sort of more regular technologies on top, like the wind or solar, peak load. You actually, in terms of your modelling and your thinking, actually turn it upside down, and because of the range or mix of technologies, that provides an equivalent to that baseload cover, and then you need the solar thermal or the gas turbines to just fill in the little gaps. Is that right?
That's a fantastic explanation. Just to reinforce it, I'll try and restate it a little differently, but it's the same thing really. So you have to imagine, we start with what's called baseload demand. And what happens to electricity demand, or at least until recently, was that demand is very low during the night, and that is the base. And then in winter, we get a peak at breakfast time, and then it drops again, and then a peak at dinner time, and then it falls down again in the evening to that base. So the baseload demand is the line that's drawn through that low base, and the traditional view was you supply baseload demand with what are called baseload power stations, which are basically coal and nuclear. Now you can operate gas as base load, but because the gas fuel is expensive, it's not a very good idea to do that. It just becomes too expensive. So really gas is more peak load or intermediate load. So the old traditional view was you had base load power stations supplying base load demand, that flat bit, and then the peaks were supplied by peak load stations, which are far more agile, flexible stations like gas turbines, and outside of South Australia like hydroelectricity with dams. So they can be turned on and off very quickly, they can be boosted up and down very quickly, so the peaks fit on top. But the base stations, the coal or the nuclear in France, are very inflexible. They can't really follow those peaks in demand. Well, in France they try to, they've got so much nuclear, but it adds to the costs, the maintenance costs dramatically. It's trying to follow the peaks also means that they're not running their nuclear stations at full power during the base periods in the middle of the night, so they're losing money that way and not paying off that high capital cost. So we've got the base stations in the traditional view, and the peak stations, which are hydro with dams and gas turbines sitting on top. So that's the old thing, and it's totally out of date now. And it's not just our group that has shown this. It's a huge study, several huge studies done in the US for the National Renewable Energy Lab. It's a whole series of studies done in Europe on Germany and modelling the whole of Europe. So this is well established now, but unfortunately not everyone who's a promoter of nuclear power wants to accept that, because one of their main selling points is that they're a baseload power station and they can be slotted in to replace coal. They behave in the same way as coal. High capital cost, low running cost. So that's the idea. Now, as the result of the work of a number of groups around the world and our group at UNSW, and what we've been doing is simulating on a computer the operation hour by hour of the electricity grid over a period, well, initially we did 1 year, but we've now gone to 8 years. And we're using real weather data for the 100% renewable energy. So we have the real data on solar energy and wind energy across the region. And we're using real data on demand. And every hour, the whole idea is to try and supply the demand with renewable energy and to end up with the same reliability as for the existing polluting system. And what we've found is that we don't need any baseload power stations and we can still provide a reliable system. So we have effectively the energy in the base being supplied by wind and solar PV. These are fluctuating sources. So instead of having a nice baseline, it sort of goes like that, as you can imagine, as the wind varies and the sun, clouds go across the sun and night comes and so on. So how do you handle those variations in wind and solar PV? You put on top of them the reliable, dispatchable peak load stations, which are in the whole market, hydro with dams, gas turbines, and concentrated solar thermal power with thermal storage. It's that storage that enables concentrated solar thermal to be quite a flexible source of electricity. Now, some enthusiasts at the beginning who got really keen on concentrated solar thermal said, well, if you put enough storage in, it'll be baseload. It can replace baseload coal. The problem with that view is first that you get runs of fairly dull days in winter, and concentrated solar doesn't operate during dull days. Solar PV does with flat plate collectors, but the concentrators have to focus direct sunlight in order to work. So in fact, concentrated solar is not baseload in winter at all. And the second thing is that we found that it plays a much better role as helping to meet those evening peaks in demand from the store of energy in those molten salt tanks. Its greatest strength is not being able to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which you can do sometimes, especially in summer, but in being there as a source of storage, to come in when there isn't enough direct sunshine for, or wind, but there has been enough to charge up the molten salt tanks. And so doing our modelling has been a terrific learning process. So we've learned, and because we had this brilliant PhD student, Ben Elliston, who designed the computer program, so we can run through a whole year's hourly data using real weather data and real demand. His program does a whole year in half a second.
Wow.
So it means that we can do hundreds or thousands of runs overnight with different mixes of renewable energy. And if we put costs onto the capital cost and the operating cost, we can optimise. We can say, what is the configuration, what is the mix of renewable energy sources that gives the cheapest annual cost? What is the optimal mix? And we've done that. And shall I go on and just, as I'm getting wound up on this. So initially we chose the cost projections for renewable energy and fossil fuels produced by the federal government's Bureau of Resources and Energy Economics. Now we didn't do this because we believed that their projections were realistic. We think that they are excessively conservative for renewable energy and excessively optimistic for fossil fuels. And nuclear, I should say, incredibly optimistic. But we wanted to avoid being accused of making assumptions just to suit ourselves. So we tried first their projections of costs. And I should say that one reason why I say that their projections of costs for renewable energy were conservative was that in 2012 they published a projection for photovoltaic costs for 2030. And that projection was reached last year.
Oh.
Okay, now admittedly photovoltaics has been going like a house on fire, but wind is also getting cheaper every year, because not at the same rate. And so is concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage as the market overseas slowly grows. So anyway, we put in their figures for the costs and we got an optimal mix of renewable energy. This was initially just based on 1 year's data, 2010 data, and it was based, as I said, on the federal government projections. And what we found was that the optimal mix, using those figures, wind provided 46% of the electricity generation in the national electricity market, nearly half, even more than currently in South Australia. Solar PV, about 20%. Concentrated solar thermal, about 20%. Existing hydro, about 6%. In 2010, it was about 6%. And the remainder from gas turbines then was 6%. Now, the amazing thing that we found then was that the two most variable sources, wind and solar PV, together supplied 2/3 of the annual electricity generation. And this was technologies where so-called experts were saying 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you couldn't have more than 5% of your variable sources in the grid before the whole system would collapse. Well, now since then, we have those initial studies which we published were simply based on putting the wind turbines in our system that was necessary to supply the demand on all the existing sites, except making them bigger in the computer program, okay? Now the problem is that most of the existing wind farms in South Australia and in Victoria are all in the same wind regime. So we could even get an optimal mix which was reliable doing it that way, but more recently we have spread out our hypothetical wind farms into New South Wales and even a few in Queensland where the wind speeds aren't that high, but the wind properties are totally different from in the south. And now we find, and this is unpublished data, but it will be published soon, based on 8
first, folks.
Yeah, based on 8 years of hourly data, that basically we can go over 50% wind. We can have more than 20% solar PV. We don't need that much concentrated solar thermal. And the gas turbine contribution shrinks from 6% to 2%. So it becomes almost negligible. to the point where I can say, look, I don't really care if it runs for the next 10 years on natural gas. There's so little gas going to be burnt, it's negligible. But we can eventually replace it with biofuels. So that's for the whole national electricity market. Now, for the study that we've done for the Conservation Council, Ben Elston, who's now Dr. Ben Elston, did a run, a fairly rough run, an initial run, on South Australia alone. So we said, what happens if South Australia wasn't connected to Victoria? Could it still operate reliably on 100% renewables? And the answer is yes, but there are some challenges. And we now want to redo the runs because what we haven't done in South Australia, part of the challenge is there's less geographic diversity, particularly for the wind farms. And in our initial run, because we ran out of time, we put all the wind farms basically on the same site, which is not a very good idea. So we want to spread them out within South Australia, and that will help a bit and make the whole thing easier. Now, having said that, I'm not recommending that South Australia disconnect from the national electricity market. There are a number of other reasons why it's a good idea to remain connected. Well, one of the reasons is that there's an issue about maintaining the alternating current frequency of 50 cycles per second, 50 hertz. So the electricity that comes out of your power point oscillates 50 times a second, like that. And it's alternating current, and the reason that we use alternating current is it's easier to transform between high voltage and low voltage and so on. So at present, the 50 cycles is maintained by having heavy rotating machinery, such as the generators in a coal-fired power station or a gas-fired power station, which rotate. They're very heavy, they have a lot of angular momentum, and they maintain a certain frequency. So one of the challenges in going to 100% renewables is to be able to maintain that frequency. And some of the opponents of renewable energy are using this and claiming, oh, well, we can't possibly go to 100% because we couldn't keep a fixed frequency of alternating current. Now, although there is a challenge here, it has been grossly exaggerated by the nuclear industry and other opponents of renewable energy. And I have an appendix in my report to the Conservation Council which discusses this issue and some of the solutions. So it's challenging, but it's solvable. And in fact, what most people don't know is that 2 states in northern Germany are now running on 100% renewable electricity net. Yeah. Now, the net means that they are connected to each other and to their neighbours, so that if one state has too much wind, it can sell excess wind over the transmission lines, and if another state has too little wind at the time, it can buy across. And it seems to be working quite well, and so far I've searched the German literature. My German isn't great, even though my parents spoke German, they came from Austria. But as far as I can see, the system is working fine, although it has some challenges that have to be addressed technically from time to time, but it's working with 100% net. Now, actually, if we come back to South Australia, the South Australian grid has now operated on a number of occasions for several hours, in fact for a whole day on one occasion, when 2/3 of the electricity was being supplied by wind and solar PV. 2/3 already. So although you're on a 40% annual average, there are times, and in fact you've had spikes where it's been close to 100%, and you haven't had blackouts, the system hasn't collapsed, and so on. But it does, those events do provide some challenges. And in fact, a few days ago, last weekend in fact, Northern Power Station dropped off the system suddenly, unexpectedly. Wind and gas took over and coped well, even though there was no warning. Okay, so those who are saying, oh, it's impossible and so on, are really exaggerating grossly. There are challenges involved, and it would be much harder if South Australia wasn't connected. Now, one of the nice things is that one of the connections between South Australia and Victoria is being upgraded a bit. Not as much as people like I would like. In fact, I would like to see a new transmission line built joining Port Augusta to Broken Hill into New South Wales, to the main eastern grid, because there's no connection directly to New South Wales. And this would benefit South Australia because it could sell excess wind power. It would benefit New South Wales because they could install a lot of solar farms and wind farms in western New South Wales, particularly where there's a lot of direct sunshine, and feed into that transmission line. And if hot rock geothermal power ever becomes commercially available, and there's a big if there in South Australia, a line could be built to join that site to Broken Hill and join that main new proposed transmission line. So there's nothing wrong with building an interconnection. They are expensive. You're up for $1 billion or $2 billion, depending on what the capacity of the line is. But it wouldn't be paid for by South Australia alone. New South Wales would benefit, it would have to pay. It would be federal government infrastructure, and under a more enlightened federal government, they would have to contribute as well. And in fact, the other states in the national electricity market, Queensland and Victoria, would also benefit indirectly because the current transmission system is a long, skinny thing that goes all the way from South Australia to far north Queensland. It's not a stable system in itself. Even with no renewable energy, it's very problematic to run such a long, skinny system like that. And to have links coming across would provide a stability, an additional stability that would benefit all the states in the market. Now, I've rambled on for a while on this. Please forgive me.
No, you've got so much knowledge. It's fantastic. I've got heaps more questions, but I'm keen to perhaps, to open up to the floor. So maybe we'll have 3 or 4, and then we might explore some other issues. But yeah, Paul.
I'm curious to know what sort of machines should be in the wind power turbines, because there's different generators you can use. What's the optimum one to give this stability? I mean, I know this is getting technical for people, but I'm just kind of curious.
Well, you can have synchronous generators which run at the appropriate frequency, but that's not the way they're going. But one of the ways they're going is to say, well, it doesn't really matter that much. Well, there's all sorts of funny things like doubly fed such and such with twerps attached, you know. But power electronics is evolving so quickly that wind turbines will be able to play a role in maintaining the frequency in the future. They don't do it now. There's a lot of research going on, a little bit by the Australian Energy Market Operator, but mostly in the United States by the National Renewable Energy Lab, which has been modelling 80 to 90% renewable electricity in the US. One of the things you can do is, if you've adjusted your wind turbines correctly, if you have too much generation, what happens is that the frequency rises, the frequency of the alternating current. So it really is no problem to drop off the output of the wind turbines. You can do that within a fraction of a second or within a few seconds. And the short response in our system is 6 seconds, actually. So you can reduce the wind turbine output. It does require some new control equipment, but it doesn't require innovation, new technologies. It just requires rolling out these technologies. Now, what happens if you have too little power, too much demand? The frequency will then drop. Now, there's a number of ways you can handle this. Sorry, this is just a technical thing, all right? We don't have to do a lot of technical stuff. But if the frequency drops, now one way of handling it that the US is looking at is to normally operate wind turbines just a little bit below their full potential at that wind speed. And so if the frequency drops, you can suddenly increase the wind turbine output by just tilting the blades a little to get the maximum output at that wind speed, and that would handle the short term. But there's a better way of handling that imbalance between supply and demand, and that is to reduce demand quickly. And now we are at a situation where new smart devices are coming on. Victoria has implemented some smart meters, only they're really only a quarter smart. They're really mostly dumb meters. But, well, I mean, you can look at them and you can find out what your consumption is. But a really smart meter, you could program in advance to maybe if you're assuming you're in a situation where the price of your electricity is changing all the time as supply and demand change, which is where we're moving towards, then you could program your device to switch off your fridge for half an hour, which wouldn't affect your food in that short period, or switch off your air conditioner for half an hour. And you could either do that yourself by programming it, or you could sign a contract with the electricity supplier and they can switch it off remotely. But of course you would then require some benefit, some financial benefit, which might be a reduction in the fixed charge that you pay, the supply charge. Okay, so all this is opening up now, all this potential. And of course, there's nothing radically new about this except that the technologies for doing it are becoming cheaper. So for example, already in the national electricity market, at least one aluminium smelter, which has a huge amount of demand, can be switched off if necessary for up to an hour. Now, these smelters have these gigantic pots of molten aluminium, and switching off the power for an hour is not... The heat capacity of those pots is so huge that the smelting process can continue. And of course, aluminium smelters get incredibly cheap electricity. The only place we know how cheap is in Victoria, but it's a state secret in all the other states that have smelters. And some of us feel that in fact the subsidy is enormous. But that's another story. Sorry.
That's right. Ooh, there's lots of hands up. Maybe one at the back. Oh, I'll go right to the back. Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, you haven't mentioned, although you did mention you will get to water, there is also wave technology that I've heard about. I don't know a lot about it. I was just wondering whether that would be possibly able to be used to bring up the base load in the trough periods instead of using gas turbines. My concern of gas turbines, of course, is it might be used for an argument to continue with CSG or something like that.
Right.
So going more renewable as quickly as possible is the preference.
Okay, so in our modelling, so far we've only used commercially available technologies. Now, wave power is at a very interesting stage of development. We would call it the demonstration stage. There's about 20 different types of wave power converter around the world at present, and a number of them are being tested, including a couple in Australia. One is at Fremantle in Western Australia. I'm not sure if there's one in South Australia. There is. Yeah. Okay. Also,
To linger at this point in time.
okay, so the challenge with wave power is that we don't know which kind of technology can survive long enough and what it's going to cost. So we've seen a number of wave power generators being wiped out by the very rigorous conditions. So there was one at Port Kembla in New South Wales that got smashed. Off the coast of Portugal, there was one that looks like a string of gigantic sausages all joined together. So if you can imagine two sausages, in the waves they sort of articulate like that, and that movement can be converted into electricity. Well, that one got wiped out recently too. So we're not quite ready to include wave power, but maybe in 5 years' time we will know which are the technologies that survive and what would be a likely cost if they were mass produced. So it's certainly South Australia has waves. I'm sure a lot of you can, who are surfers can certainly support that. But it's not part of our mix at present. It was part of the mix by the modelling by the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO. So they did modelling, and they included some wave power, and they included some hypothetical hot rock geothermal. And the nuclear supporters are saying, you see, they had to have geothermal power, which is baseload power, in order to run their system. Well, that's not true. We reran the AEMO we simulated their system, and then we subtracted the geothermal and wave power, and we found it would still work reliably without the geothermal or the wave power. So this is one of the beauties of simulation. You know, people sneer at it, but very cheaply, once you've got the program going, you can do the most incredible experiments on what if we change the system in this way. And provided we gradually make the system more and more sophisticated, we start with a simple system so we know what's going on, and then we gradually add complexity, which is what we've been doing, then we can hopefully understand how the real system works better and better.
The gentleman with the striped shirt, Julie, if you want to, and then we might come down the front, but I'll try and get as many people as possible.
You mentioned a lot about hydropower and a lot of benefits.
Yes.
So there's been talk about just taking cheap and simple PV and just running water pumps and just pumping water up as a source of instant power. Have you done any costings of that type of technology? It's all existing stuff.
We haven't, and there is in fact a small-scale system proposed for New South Wales by a private group which will have just that. It will have PV plus some pumped hydro. It will be really small scale. Now, however, for South Australia, you've reminded me, I wanted to come back to that. There is no potential for freshwater, large dams and so on with hydro. But there may be potential for what we call seawater pumped hydro, because you do have some very high hills within 15 or 20 kilometres of the coast, near Port Pirie and Port Augusta. That's a lot of potential. Now the question is, what would be the economics of pumping seawater up to a small reservoir in the hills, or to several small reservoirs? So you're not talking about big dams. What we've found is, to fill the gaps in wind and sun, you're looking at gaps of about 1 or 2 hours mostly. And so you don't need a big dam, you need a big height difference with big pipes, so that you can provide a lot of power for a short period of time. While the idea of having a big dam, which can be environmentally so destructive, is to provide power for seasonal storage, you know. Well, we don't need seasonal storage with wind and solar. We need short-term storage. So, and the theory is, and a number of groups, Professor Andrew Blake is at the ANU, and the Melbourne University group have been looking at the potential for this small-scale, well, it's really small dam pumped hydro. And we haven't tried to do the economics of it yet. I don't know a lot about pipelines and what the pumping energy would be required and all that. Although we can find a student to work on it. That's the only way we can get cheap labour nowadays. The university situation is appalling. So it may be that South Australia might be able to use quite significantly seawater pumped hydro. And this is not a new technology. There are systems in Japan, for example, but they are situated on cliffs right at the ocean. Now those cliffs are not very high, maybe 100 metres high, right at the ocean. Now we're saying South Australia has got cliffs 5, 6, 7, 800 metres high, but they may be 15 kilometres back from the coast. Is it still viable? We don't know the answer, but it wouldn't be too hard to find out.
At the back there?
Yes, hi, thanks. You've touched on the challenges coming up in terms of climate change and drought, and in South Australia, where we have probably some population growth planned as well. Now, what in terms of if we've got 50% extra people and we've got a drought that might be, I don't know how many years, but it could be a long drought. How would the power supply, say, desalination plants? Would it be able to?
Well, South Australia has so much wind and solar potential, you could easily run desalination plants in that way. And in fact, the Sydney desalination plant is run off a wind farm not far from Canberra, actually, at Lake George. Now, of course, it's not the electrons that are produced for electricity near Lake George that run the power station, but it provides the equivalent amount of power. And so the answer is yes. This would be one way. And in fact, one of the nice things about using wind or solar PV for things like water pumping or water purification is that you don't need continuous power. So if you have an excess of wind power for a while, you can use it in batches, and then if the wind drops, you don't use it for that purpose, you just stick to providing electricity for households and businesses and industries. So it's one way of soaking up the excess renewable energy. Now, I should say, if you have 100% renewable electricity, you will have periods when there's a fair bit of excess wind power that you can't use. So either you have to transmit it across to the eastern coast, where there's huge potential demand, or you have to find industries that can use that electricity intermittently. And that's another possibility.
Down the front here.
Hi, we're looking at losing... Oh, sorry. Hi, we're looking at losing the power stations up in, well, one's already down, but in Port Augusta. And that could possibly happen in March next year. That's how close that could be happening. I mean, originally they were talking 2030, and now we're down to possibly March next year. What do you see as being the best alternative to take that over for producing power for South Australia?
Okay, well, the first thing I would have to say is that my understanding is that you have an overcapacity of generating plant, or at least you did have before Northern looked like it's going out for good. And so it won't be necessary to replace the whole of those power stations. And that's very important, because the proposal for Port Augusta is for concentrated solar thermal power, which is really the most expensive at present of all the renewable energy sources. So it would be a good idea, in my personal view, to start with a smaller system, like 50 megawatts electric, instead of trying to provide hundreds of megawatts, which would be very expensive. 50 megawatts would be a much more reasonable size, and you have to keep in mind that that could be expanded if required, and every time, if you do need a new 50 megawatt unit, it's going to be cheaper the next time, and the next one after that will be cheaper again, because that technology is still very expensive simply because the world market is very small at present. But it is growing slowly, the market, and the price is coming down slowly. So, for example, a couple of years ago, the sort of typical price from some of these systems would be about 25 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, the latest that are being built overseas will generate at 17 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's in 2 years. That's not bad. And so if the market continues to grow, I think we'll see that price continue to come down to under 12 cents a kilowatt hour. And then it's still expensive, but the thing is, as one element in a mix of different cheaper renewable energy sources, it won't be a particular problem economically. But if you try and supply the whole of Northern Power Station with concentrated solar thermal, it's a big bill, and one can understand some people jacking up.
Thank you very much. Wonderful talk. Two questions, very short. Besides this 1982 CSIRO decision, what was the most effective thing the coal industry did to scupper renewables? Number two, imagine, this is a hypothetical, the Mineral Council of Australia phones you up and says, Mark, come over to the dark side, help us slow our own death spiral, help us slow the advance of renewables, and hypothetically you say yes, very hypothetical, what would you do?
Well, for a start, some of my colleagues at UNSW have had offers from the coal industry to do research on various aspects, like environmental aspects, and some of them have accepted, and I refuse to work for the coal industry. I simply wouldn't believe the Minerals Council. The problem with coal is that most of the industry people there have taken up a position is that they're going to die in a ditch. They'll fight to the death, and they're going to die as an industry. But some parts of the oil industry have been smarter and have diversified their investments. Now actually, even BHP Billiton is diversifying its investments. It used to be very heavy both in coal and in uranium, so it was sort of ironic. You know, they would say, well, you can choose between nuclear power or coal power. You can choose between BHP Billiton and BHP Billiton. But I'd be very sceptical. There are issues, not so much the coal industry, but the electricity utilities who are very close to the coal industry, many of them. And that's been one of the biggest blows at present. The main reason the renewable energy target is under threat has been the electricity industry, not specific. I'm sure the coal industry is doing its best to stop renewable energy if they can, but the electricity industry is having to change its business models. And it's happening at the large-scale wholesale end and at the smaller scale retail end. So at the wholesale end, what's happening is, and we've seen it here in South Australia, is that the way the whole market, the electricity market works is that every 5 minutes or whatever period, a power station bids a price of electricity that it wants to supply. And the operator of the grid takes the lowest price first, and then the next one, and then the next one, until demand is met. Okay? Now the problem is that the cheapest, on the South Australian grid, the cheapest power system to operate, although it has a capital cost, is wind. It has almost no operating cost, although there is a small maintenance cost. And so it undercuts what was formerly baseload power. So one of the reasons why these coal-fired power stations are closing down in South Australia is that they can't operate as baseload because wind is undermining them. And some of them are actually admitting that and saying it, not very nicely saying it. And so that's called the merit order effect. It's a fancy name, but it's the order of, the ranked order of generating that's allowed. And what's more, the other effect of the merit order is that it affects the price of electricity, the wholesale price at the time, because what happens is when you have all these power stations going in to supply the demand, the price of electricity determined for that period is the one from the highest cost that is generating. Now, when you've got wind in, that highest cost is decreased. And that's when coal power used to make most of its profits. So that's why I'm saying coal is finished in South Australia. And in the long run, it's going to be finished in Australia. But it might be quite a long run because they will fight to the death. Now, at the other end is the death spiral. The death spiral. Which is demand on the grid has been declining every year for the last 5 years. Although there's been a slight turn up in the last 2 or 3 months. And the reason it's been declining has been the growth of rooftop photovoltaics. It's also been the high retail prices of electricity, which have encouraged people to use electricity more efficiently. And then in the long term, there's the continual decline in manufacturing in Australia. So all these things add up to keep reducing the price of reducing the demand for electricity from the grid. And this means, well, the first response of the electricity supplier is we're selling less electricity, so we have to charge more for a unit of electricity. If they charge more people put on PV and go for energy efficiency, and demand decreases further, and you get the death spiral. Now, the electricity industry has a stay of execution with this business model because, as you know, your electricity bill has two components. You pay for the electricity you use, the energy you use, but there's also a fixed charge. It's called a supply charge or a service charge. The name varies from state to state. And that charge is the same. It might be 80 cents a day or $1 a day, but the utilities are lifting that charge because you pay that even if you use no electricity. And the problem with raising that fixed charge is that it undermines solar. I mean, if you're going to pay a big fixed charge, why put in solar or why become energy efficient? It's a bit like using a landline phone now. Most of us probably don't actually pay for most of our phone calls, but we pay a monthly fee. Now, so what they're doing is trying to lift the fixed charge, the service or supply charge. So they've delayed the death spiral because batteries aren't cheap enough yet for most of us to disconnect from the grid. The batteries are becoming cheaper. The writing is on the wall. The business model has to change. Now, in fact, although it would be nice to disconnect totally from the grid, I would argue we actually need to keep a grid, transmission and distribution system. For a start, renewable energy isn't spread uniformly across the state or across the country. Our demand is not uniform. We need to be able to transport electricity around still, even if we've got a lot of distributed sources of energy on rooftops and so on. So the challenge is to design a business model, and I would like to see an electricity industry of sorts surviving with a business model that maintains the existence of a grid, but also encourages distributed supply of electricity from rooftops and so on. And a lot of us are working on that problem. It's not a trivial problem to work out a system for doing this, but it's better to try and find a solution than to just try and kill renewable energy, because in the long run, renewable energy is unstoppable. The Abbott government has succeeded in dramatically slowing down large-scale renewables, but the ACT, with its renewable energy target and its reverse auctions, is keeping the whole thing going on a small scale. And if South Australia follows the same approach, it would become very exciting, the whole situation. There's also discussion in Victoria now that it has a new government about whether they can go it alone without federal cooperation.
Okay, I might come down here.
So the figure I've heard, you spoke about how solar thermal is still quite expensive, and the figure I've heard is something like 800 million for 50 megawatts. That's the figure I saw on paper the other day. I mean, at that price we could put photovoltaics on a great fraction of the roofs in South Australia. Wouldn't we be better off thinking about, say, distributed domestic storage, you know, bringing in batteries and so forth to supply these, you know, to fill these gaps rather than, you know, solar thermal? Isn't that sort of a distraction that might get in the way?
I think we will need storage on a larger scale, and concentrated solar thermal is one way of providing that with a generating system. We don't have to provide batteries at the residential level. The price of batteries is coming down. We have Tesla and one other large corporation building factories to roll out lithium-ion batteries on a huge scale. That will certainly bring down the price, although I have to say there's a lot of hype. It's not going to be like tomorrow and so on. I think you're looking at a 10-year timescale to really get substantial reductions in battery prices. And even then, they will be too expensive for most suburban people to disconnect from the grid, but they will be not too expensive for most suburban people to have enough batteries with solar on their roof to meet their evening peak. See, right now, rooftop solar is highly cost-effective for households or businesses that have a significant electricity demand during the daytime that they can avoid with solar on their roofs. But if you are out during the daytime, or if you don't have you don't use much electricity during the daytime, you're not going to be paid much for feeding power back into the grid. I think it's about 6 cents, isn't it, in South Australia? 6.2?
Depends when you got the solar power.
For some, they're still part of it.
Okay, yes, so it's different. But the situation generally in the national electricity market is that the feed-in tariff varies from 0, and my distributor pays, my retailer pays 0, to 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And yet we are paying anything upwards 25, 28, 30, 35 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on what time of day and where we are. And some people pay 50 cents a kilowatt hour at certain times of day. And a strong case can be made that the feed-in tariff is too low and needs to be made fairer. Now, I chose my retailer because at the time they were the only retailer that wasn't opposing the renewable energy target. So I had to go along with 0 feed-in tariff, but I can change that. My contract expires in July. We now have another retailer that's coming to New South Wales. But still, there's a lot of hype about home batteries, and I've been trying to get my system with batteries in there, and basically you'd have to be a pioneer and be prepared to pay a fortune. You'd have to be prepared 2 or 3 times the price of lithium-ion batteries in motor vehicles to have them at home for electricity system. And it's because it's just the early stages. And it's really quite complex, as I found, that, I mean, you need a proper control system. When you can't just buy the PV and buy the inverter and buy the batteries and just tie them together. You need quite a supple system to make the whole thing work. And yes, you can buy a complete system from Germany, from Bosch. A small system will cost you $25,000 to $30,000, and I mean small. And that's ridiculous. You know, if you just look at the cost of the components, it should be half that. But, and it will become half that, but it won't be overnight. So I've got off the track again.
You mentioned about retailers who oppose the RES.
Yes.
On everyone's seats, we've got a partnership with Diamond Energy that we set up, and we chose to go with them because they were one of the few retailers in South Australia who were strong supporters of the RES. And I think that idea of actually consumers choosing to place their dollars with companies, just like banks or superannuation companies, is a really important part of the energy conversation. And it leads on into that idea of community-owned power as well, which when I look at places like Germany, and I see the level of support for renewables over there, and my understanding is a lot of that is because the community themselves own significant parts of the energy supply system. So, yeah, keen for your thoughts on that sort of community ownership aspect of energy.
Community renewable energy was the basis of the industries in Denmark and Germany. So in Denmark, it was basically farmers. Small groups of farmers would get together, and because the government had passed legislation that if you had a wind turbine and fed power into the grid, first the electricity utility would have to accept that power, and some utilities in Australia are refusing to accept feed-ins. And secondly, they had to pay a fair price for it. And of course, there was a debate about what is a fair price. And the legislation in Denmark smoothed that whole process. And so groups of farmers could go to a bank and say, we want to invest in a wind turbine. And the bank would say, great, tell us what you want. And the bank would lend them the money. And then when the wind turbine was built and operating, the bank would collect the revenue, take its mortgage out, and feed the profits onto people. And it was all done in a very smooth, well-organised way. So there weren't any real barriers. And that was the basis for the rapid growth, the rapid renaissance of wind power in Denmark in the 20th century, basically in the 1980s onwards. In Germany,